August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. 8:16 in the morning. A towering column of dust and smoke climbs into a sky that moments earlier was clear and quiet. The city below has vanished into fire and debris. Streets are erased. Wooden homes burn in long, unbroken lines. Survivors stumble through ruins, their clothes torn away, skin burned, eyes searching for family, for water, for help that does not yet exist. Bridges choke with the injured. Rivers fill with people seeking relief from flames and unbearable heat. Doctors who survived search desperately for bandages, medicine, anything to stop bleeding. But hospitals lie crushed, equipment destroyed, nurses missing. In the silence after the blast, rescue begins not with organized teams, but with the wounded helping the wounded, strangers carrying strangers through a city that no longer resembles a city. And to understand why Hiroshima's rescue became one of history's most desperate humanitarian struggles, we must first look at the final months of a war already reshaping the world. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had entered its final and most destructive phase. In Europe, Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, ending years of conflict across the continent. But in the Pacific, the war continued with brutal intensity. Japanese and Allied forces fought across islands scattered over thousands of miles of ocean, each battle exacting enormous losses. American forces had advanced steadily toward the Japanese home islands through campaigns in the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each victory came at terrible cost. On Okinawa alone, which ended in June 1945, over 12,000 American troops were killed, while Japanese military deaths exceeded 70,000. Tens of thousands of civilians also perished. The fighting convinced many American planners that an invasion of mainland Japan would be catastrophic. At the same time, Japan's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Its navy was crippled. Merchant shipping had been largely destroyed by submarine warfare. Fuel and food shortages spread across cities. Allied bombers conducted relentless air raids, targeting industrial centers and transportation networks. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, demonstrating the destructive power already being used before nuclear weapons entered the conflict. Yet, Japan's leadership remained divided over surrender. Some officials sought negotiation, hoping to preserve the imperial system. Others prepared for total defense, expecting civilians to resist invasion alongside soldiers. Military planners mobilized remaining resources for what they believed would be the final battle on home soil. Meanwhile, in the United States, a secret program years in the making reached completion. Known as the Manhattan Project, it involved thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers developing a weapon unlike anything previously imagined, a bomb powered by nuclear fission. Its potential destructive force promised to end the war quickly, but its use also raised profound moral and strategic questions among political and military leaders. In July 1945, the first successful atomic test occurred in New Mexico. The explosion confirmed that a single device could destroy an entire city. Soon after, American military planners selected potential targets in Japan. These cities were chosen for military value and for having remained relatively untouched by previous bombing, allowing the effects of the new weapon to be clearly measured. Hiroshima appeared high on that list. It served as headquarters for the Japanese Second Army, responsible for defending southern Japan. The city contained military depots, communication centers, and logistics hubs supporting troops across the region. Its size and surrounding geography made it an ideal site to demonstrate the bomb's destructive capacity. On July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Japanese authorities did not accept the terms, hoping instead for diplomatic mediation through the Soviet Union, which had not yet entered the war against Japan. As July turned into August, preparations quietly continued. Weather reconnaissance flights surveyed potential targets. Bomb crews trained in secrecy. Few people inside Japan knew that a new kind of weapon was ready for use. In Hiroshima itself, daily life continued under the shadow of war. Yet, without the widespread devastation already seen in cities like Tokyo or Osaka. Factories still operated. Military personnel moved through the streets. Civilians endured shortages and air raid warnings. But the city remained largely intact. No one yet knew that within days, Hiroshima would become the first city in history to experience nuclear warfare, and that its survival would soon depend not on armies, but on desperate rescue efforts born from sudden annihilation. To understand why the rescue response collapsed so completely, we must look at the city itself on the eve of destruction. In the early summer of 1945, Hiroshima still functioned as a living city, even under the strain of prolonged war. Unlike Tokyo, Osaka, or Kobe, it had escaped the massive firebombing raids that had already reduced many Japanese urban centers to ashes. Some residents even believed their city might be spared entirely. Few imagined that its survival marked it instead for a different kind of attack. Hiroshima lay on a wide delta, where the Ota River split into several branches before reaching the inland sea. 6 rivers crossed the city, connected by dozens of bridges that linked residential districts, markets, factories, schools, and military installations. The terrain was mostly flat, surrounded by hills on 3 sides. This geography, though picturesque in peacetime, would later trap heat and blast pressure within the city center. By August 1945, Hiroshima's population stood between 300,000 and 350,000 people. Wartime evacuations had already sent many children and elderly residents to rural areas. Yet, military personnel, labor units, and workers from nearby regions increased daytime population numbers. Soldiers, students mobilized for factory labor, and civilian defense volunteers filled the streets each morning. The city played an important military role. It housed the headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, responsible for defending Western Japan against a potential Allied invasion. Large troop concentrations, supply depots, and logistical centers operated in and around Hiroshima. Rail lines passing through the city connected vital military transport routes, moving equipment and soldiers across southern Japan. Yet Hiroshima was not solely a military center. Residential neighborhoods stretched between commercial zones and industrial districts. Wooden homes stood closely packed along narrow streets. Small workshops produced military supplies. Streetcars moved workers through the city each morning. Markets opened early, despite food shortages affecting much of the country. Air raid sirens had become a routine part of life. American reconnaissance planes frequently flew overhead, photographing cities and military sites. Because these flights often involved only a few aircraft, alarms were sometimes canceled quickly, leading many residents to treat warnings casually. On several occasions in late July and early August, sirens sounded only for the all clear to follow soon after. This routine would prove fatal. Residents grew accustomed to returning to daily activities after each warning, unaware that reconnaissance flights were surveying future atomic targets. Medical infrastructure in Hiroshima reflected a city preparing for invasion rather than total destruction. Several hospitals and clinics operated across the city, along with military medical facilities. Doctors, nurses, and medical students trained to treat injuries from conventional bombing or invasion combat. Supplies, however, were already scarce due to wartime shortages. Civil defense programs organized volunteer groups to clear fire breaks, demolishing selected buildings to prevent fires from spreading in case of air raids. On the morning of August 6th, thousands of students and civilian workers gathered outdoors to continue this demolition work, unintentionally placing large numbers of people directly beneath the future blast zone. Transport functioned normally that morning. Streetcars carried commuters. Soldiers marched to posts. Office workers reported for duty. Children attended mobilization work assignments rather than regular school classes, as education had been redirected toward wartime labor. Shortly after 7 a.m., air raid sirens sounded once again when American weather reconnaissance aircraft approached. But as before, only a small number of planes appeared on radar. The alert was canceled around 7:30 a.m. Residents returned to work, believing danger had passed. By 8 a.m., the city settled into routine activity. Shops opened, factories operated, morning sunlight reflected off river surfaces. Many civilians moved outdoors, increasing exposure to what would soon occur. At approximately 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a single uranium bomb from high altitude. 43 seconds later, the weapon detonated about 600 meters above the city center. In an instant, Hiroshima's infrastructure, hospitals, communication centers, fire departments, transportation, and government offices, disappeared or became inoperable. Doctors and rescue workers themselves became casualties. Roads filled with debris, fires ignited across wooden neighborhoods. And in the seconds after the explosion, Hiroshima ceased to function as an organized city, leaving survivors alone to begin rescue efforts in a place where nearly every system needed for rescue had been destroyed. What followed was not only devastation, but a desperate struggle for survival seen through multiple human and military perspectives. In the first minutes after the explosion, organized rescue did not exist. Communication networks were gone. Police stations burned. Fire departments collapsed. Military headquarters lay in ruins. Those who could still move became rescuers by necessity. Across the city, people who had themselves been injured began helping others without understanding what had happened. Survivors described wandering through darkness, filled with dust and smoke, stumbling over debris and bodies, calling out for family members who did not answer. Many were burned, clothes torn away by the blast, skin hanging from arms and faces. Yet they continued walking, driven by shock and instinct. On bridges and roadways, injured civilians helped strangers stand, guiding them toward rivers or open spaces away from fires. Mothers carried children whose burns worsened with each step. Soldiers, themselves wounded, helped civilians reach safer ground. School students assigned to demolition work became both victims and helpers, pulling classmates from collapsed buildings. Eyewitness accounts describe long, silent lines of survivors moving outward from the city center. Some carried relatives on makeshift stretchers made from doors or boards. Others used bicycles or carts to transport the injured. Many simply supported each other while walking. Because hospitals had been destroyed or overwhelmed, rescue often meant leading victims to riverbanks where survivors hoped water would ease burns. Thousands entered rivers seeking relief, some drowning due to weakness or injuries. Others remained along the banks, waiting for help that could not yet arrive. No one understood radiation sickness. Rescuers handled victims without protection. unknowingly exposing themselves to deadly contamination. Yet fear of disease or danger rarely stopped them. Immediate human instinct overruled caution. In the absence of command, ordinary civilians became the first line of rescue. Their efforts saved countless lives, even as many rescuers themselves later succumbed to injuries or radiation exposure. But survival alone was not enough. Soon another crisis emerged, a medical catastrophe beyond anything doctors had ever encountered. Hiroshima's medical system was destroyed almost instantly. An estimated 90% of the city's doctors and nurses were killed or injured in the blast. Hospitals located near the explosion collapsed or burned. Equipment, medicine, and surgical facilities disappeared within seconds. Doctors who survived often did so because they happened to be outside the immediate blast area. Many were injured themselves, suffering burns or wounds while attempting to treat others. Without sterilized equipment or proper facilities, treatment became improvisation. Surviving clinics filled within hours. Floors became crowded with patients lying side by side, burns covering their bodies. With supplies scarce, doctors used whatever remained. Torn clothing for bandages, cooking oil applied to burns, limited pain medication rationed among hundreds of patients. Medical students and volunteers stepped into roles far beyond their training. Teachers, monks, and civilians assisted with carrying patients, cleaning wounds, and distributing water. But the number of injured overwhelmed all efforts. Many victims appeared uninjured at first, only to collapse hours later. Hair began falling out. Bleeding appeared from gums and skin. Fever and weakness spread rapidly. Doctors could not explain these symptoms. Radiation sickness was not yet understood in practical medical terms. Rescue workers transporting victims unknowingly exposed themselves as well. Hospitals outside Hiroshima soon received patients whose conditions worsened mysteriously. Entire wards filled with victims suffering burns mixed with unseen internal damage. Medical rescue efforts continued day and night, but survival rates remained low. The scale of injury exceeded anything modern medicine of the time could handle. As medical teams struggled, another challenge emerged. The total destruction of infrastructure needed to organize rescue operations. Effective disaster response requires functioning infrastructure, communication, transportation, organized command. Hiroshima lost all three in seconds. Telephone lines were cut instantly, radio stations destroyed, military command centers damaged or wiped out. Without communication, surrounding regions initially did not know what had happened. Reports reaching Tokyo were fragmented and confusing, describing a city suddenly gone silent. Roadways near the blast center became impassable due to collapsed buildings, fires, and debris. Streetcars overturned, bridges clogged with injured civilians fleeing flames. Rescue vehicles could not enter large sections of the city. Firefighting proved nearly impossible. Water lines ruptured, fire stations destroyed. Firefighters themselves were among the casualties. As fires merged into firestorms, survivors could do little but flee. Rail connections into Hiroshima were disrupted, delaying arrival of outside assistance. Initial rescue teams approaching the city encountered scenes beyond comprehension. Injured survivors moving outward while the center still burned uncontrollably. Military units stationed outside the blast zone attempted to organize relief, but confusion slowed action. Officers struggled to determine the nature of the attack, suspecting massive conventional bombing rather than a single weapon. Without coordination, rescue efforts remained fragmented. Individuals helped neighbors. Small groups formed spontaneously. But organized relief took many hours to begin forming. And while survivors struggled in isolation, the full nature of the disaster was only beginning to be understood beyond Hiroshima's ruins, leading to wider responses that would shape the next phase of rescue efforts. Outside the immediate destruction zone, fragments of Hiroshima's military structure still functioned. Units stationed in surrounding districts survived the blast and began receiving streams of wounded civilians staggering out of the city. Soldiers quickly realized that something unprecedented had occurred, though few understood what. Initial reports reaching regional headquarters described Hiroshima as having suffered a massive single explosion, followed by widespread fires. Communication difficulties delayed accurate assessment. Telephone lines were destroyed, telegraph stations damaged, and messengers had to travel through burning districts to relay information. By late morning on August 6th, surviving officers began assembling emergency relief parties. Soldiers were ordered into the city to assist survivors, clear roads, and search for remaining command structures. Many of these troops entered without protective equipment, unaware that radiation exposure posed additional danger. Military trucks transported injured civilians to nearby towns where hospitals still functioned. Temporary treatment stations were established in surviving buildings outside the central destruction area. Civilians joined soldiers in organizing evacuation efforts, guiding survivors away from burning neighborhoods. Local government officials who survived attempted to restore some degree of order. Police officers helped direct injured people towards safer areas. Volunteers distributed drinking water and searched for missing relatives. Buddhist temples and schools outside the blast zone became improvised shelters for thousands who had lost homes. Yet coordination remained chaotic. Fires continued spreading throughout the afternoon, forcing rescuers to retreat repeatedly. Many rescue workers themselves became casualties due to burns, exhaustion, and radiation sickness that would only appear later. By evening, military command recognized Hiroshima as effectively destroyed. Urgent requests for medical supplies and assistance were sent to neighboring prefectures. However, transportation disruptions slowed reinforcements. Rescue operations thus evolved through improvisation rather than planning. Soldiers, civil servants, and civilians worked side by side, driven by necessity rather than organized command. And as they struggled to manage visible injuries, another invisible threat quietly began claiming lives. Unlike conventional bombing, Hiroshima's destruction carried consequences beyond blast and fire. Survivors soon began experiencing symptoms no doctor could explain. During the first hours after the explosion, rescue workers focused on burns, fractures, and wounds caused by collapsing structures. Many injured appeared stable after initial treatment. Yet, by evening, patients began vomiting, growing weak, and developing unexplained bleeding. Hair loss followed within days. Purple spots appeared under the skin. Fever spread among survivors who had no visible injuries. Doctors initially suspected infectious disease or poisoning. Few understood that exposure to radiation had damaged victims' internal organs and immune systems. Rescue workers were among those affected. Soldiers and volunteers who had entered the city to help survivors soon reported illness. Many who seemed healthy collapsed days later. Hospitals outside Hiroshima became overwhelmed not only with burn victims, but also patients suffering mysterious deterioration. The phenomenon later known as radiation sickness became one of the most tragic aspects of rescue efforts. Individuals who survived initial injuries died weeks later, despite medical care. Children and young adults appeared particularly vulnerable. Rain that fell later on August 6th carried radioactive particles across surrounding areas. Survivors caught outdoors during this so-called black rain unknowingly absorbed further contamination. Some rescue teams working in affected zones also suffered delayed illness. Because radiation could not be seen or smelled, rescuers unknowingly risked their own lives while helping others. Protective measures were non-existent, and understanding of nuclear contamination remained minimal even among military authorities. Thus, rescue became not only a struggle against visible devastation, but against a hidden danger that continued claiming victims long after fires died down. And beyond the immediate crisis, the humanitarian meaning of Hiroshima's rescue efforts would soon challenge the conscience of the world. In the days following the bombing, survivors and relief workers struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Families disappeared without trace. Schools, hospitals, and markets were reduced to ashes. Photographs taken by Japanese military photographers and later by foreign journalists revealed scenes rarely shown at the time. Injured civilians awaiting treatment in overcrowded shelters, mothers searching ruins for children, rescue teams carrying survivors across fields of debris. Temples and surviving buildings became sanctuaries for displaced residents. Relief stations distributed food and water to tens of thousands left homeless. Funeral pyres burned continuously as authorities attempted to manage overwhelming numbers of dead. Some rescue workers later described emotional numbness replacing shock. The scale of loss made individual grief difficult to process. Survivors focused simply on staying alive and helping others when possible. News of Hiroshima's destruction spread slowly due to wartime censorship and communication disruption. Outside Japan, initial reactions focused on the weapon's military significance rather than humanitarian consequences. Only later would images and survivor testimonies reveal the full extent of suffering. For those inside Hiroshima, moral questions about the bombing mattered less in the immediate aftermath than practical survival. Rescue, shelter, food, and medical care remained urgent needs. Yet as days passed, understanding grew that Hiroshima represented a turning point not only in warfare but in human history. And the rescue efforts unfolding amid ruins marked the beginning of the nuclear age's first humanitarian crisis. And within the burned city, the most critical hours of rescue were still unfolding, as survivors struggled through the first full day after the explosion. By midday on August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima had become a landscape of fire. The explosion at 8:15 a.m. had killed tens of thousands instantly. But for those who survived, the struggle for life had only begun. Fires spread rapidly through neighborhoods of wooden houses, merging into massive firestorms that consumed entire districts. Survivors closest to the blast center, many severely burned, moved instinctively away from the growing heat. Streets no longer existed in recognizable form. Landmarks were gone. People navigated through rubble guided only by rivers and distant hills. Rescue efforts remained spontaneous and uncoordinated, driven by whoever still had strength to move. Eyewitness accounts describe wounded civilians calling for water as they walked, their voices weakening with each step. Many collapsed along roadsides. Others reached bridges where crowds gathered, blocking escape routes. Some rescuers carried injured family members until exhaustion forced them to stop, laying loved ones down with promises to return. Promises often impossible to keep. Fires advanced so quickly that rescue attempts frequently failed. Survivors trying to pull victims from collapsed houses often had to abandon efforts as flames approached. Entire groups seeking safety were overtaken by spreading fires, especially in districts where demolition work earlier that morning had left people gathered outdoors. By early afternoon, black smoke covered much of the city, turning daylight into twilight. Burning debris fell from the sky. Strong winds generated by rising heat intensified flames, pushing fires into districts initially spared by the blast itself. Military units entering Hiroshima around midday faced scenes beyond prior experience. Soldiers attempting rescue operations discovered roads blocked by debris and injured civilians. Trucks could not pass through central areas. Many troops abandoned vehicles and continued on foot, carrying survivors outward. Water sources became lifelines. Rivers filled with injured people seeking relief from burns. Some entered the water willingly to cool wounds. Others stumbled in accidentally. Many were too weak to climb out again. Rescue teams attempted to pull survivors from riverbanks, but numbers overwhelmed available manpower. Hospitals that survived outside the immediate blast radius filled beyond capacity within hours. Doctors treated victims on floors, corridors, and open courtyards. Supplies ran out quickly. Makeshift bandages replaced proper medical materials. Treatment focused on easing pain rather than curing injuries. As evening approached, confusion deepened. Many families became permanently separated. Children wandered alone among crowds of displaced survivors. Parents searched desperately for missing relatives amid collapsing buildings and burning districts. Meanwhile, officials outside Hiroshima struggled to understand the scale of destruction. Reports arriving by messenger described entire sections of the city erased. Rescue assistance from neighboring areas began moving toward Hiroshima, but damaged railways and clogged roads slowed arrival. Nightfall brought new dangers. Fires continued burning, casting an orange glow across ruins. Survivors lacking shelter huddled outdoors, injured and exhausted. Cries for help echoed across open spaces where people gathered for safety. Rescue workers continued searching through debris despite darkness. Without electricity or functioning infrastructure, efforts relied on lanterns and fires for light. Many rescuers themselves collapsed from injuries or exhaustion during operations. Yet even as immediate rescue struggled against flames and destruction, a new and terrifying reality began emerging among survivors. Symptoms that conventional injuries could not explain, signaling that the worst consequences of the bombing were still unfolding. As August 6th continued, the horrors in Hiroshima shifted from visible destruction to invisible threat. Survivors who had escaped immediate burns began showing signs that puzzled even experienced doctors. Victims who appeared stable collapsed hours later. Bleeding gums, dizziness, fever, and nausea spread among those exposed to the invisible force of radiation. Doctors, lacking knowledge of nuclear fallout, could only treat symptoms, powerless to stop the underlying damage. Temporary medical stations established outside the blast zone filled with both survivors from the city and rescuers who themselves were now ill. Soldiers, volunteers, and civilians who had assisted in carrying injured people began experiencing the same symptoms. Improvised triage tents overflowed, and those still able to move continued transporting victims from riverbanks and burned streets. Exhaustion compounded injuries, leaving many too weak to reach even temporary shelter. The scale of chaos challenged any coordinated response. Military units attempted to establish command posts near the outskirts, but transportation lines remained blocked. Fires continued burning across districts, while rivers and open spaces were crowded with people seeking relief. Communication with Central Command was fragmented. leaving officers uncertain how to deploy relief effectively. Many messages never reached their destination, delayed or lost amid collapsed infrastructure. By late afternoon, the psychological toll became apparent. Survivors wandered aimlessly, traumatized and disoriented. Many had lost family members and friends, their homes obliterated, their familiar cityscape unrecognizable. Despite the relentless human effort, death continued quietly among those who had initially survived, carried off by burns, shock, or radiation-induced illness. Rescue teams improvised with limited resources. Makeshift stretchers, carts, and even doors were used to carry victims to relative safety. Water and basic supplies were rationed. Some temples, schools, and surviving public buildings were converted into emergency shelters. Monks, teachers, and civilians took on roles as caregivers, often sacrificing their own safety in the process. Night fell over Hiroshima as exhausted rescuers continued their work. Fires still burned in distant districts, embers drifting across ruined streets. Survivors huddled in groups, some sobbing, others silent from shock. The city's population had been reduced not only by the immediate blast, but by the first 24 hours of its aftermath. A cruel combination of fire, destruction, and unseen radiation. By the following morning, rescue efforts had begun to stabilize in certain districts. Neighboring towns and prefectures sent medical reinforcements. Emergency relief parties began organizing supply distribution, marking the first steps toward coordinated humanitarian response. Yet the full scope of Hiroshima's tragedy, tens of thousands dead, tens of thousands injured, a city almost entirely erased, had already been cemented in human memory. These initial hours of chaos and improvisation represent the turning point of the Hiroshima rescue effort, a struggle defined as much by courage, endurance, and compassion as by overwhelming human and environmental forces. In the days following August 6th, Hiroshima's streets remained a scene of devastation. Fires burned intermittently, consuming what rubble remained. The city's infrastructure lay in ruins. Telephone lines were down, bridges were impassable, hospitals were destroyed, and surviving medical facilities struggled to manage an overwhelming number of casualties. Yet despite these challenges, rescue and relief continued, carried forward by a combination of civilians, surviving soldiers, and volunteers from surrounding regions. Casualty numbers rose steadily as victims who initially survived the blast succumbed to injuries and radiation exposure. Estimates suggest that by the end of August, approximately 140,000 people had died in Hiroshima, nearly half of the pre-attack population. Among these, countless civilians who had sought rivers for relief or huddled in temporary shelters died from a combination of burns, trauma, and radiation sickness. Medical teams improvised solutions in the face of near-total resource collapse. Schools, temples, and public buildings became treatment centers. Doctors used whatever supplies remained: cloth for bandages, boiled water for sterilization, and basic anesthesia where available. Despite scarcity, their dedication was relentless. Eyewitness accounts describe doctors working for days without sleep, moving from patient to patient, often treating the injured with their own hands and minimal protection. Survivors reported finding their homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods gone. Yet pockets of humanity persisted. People organized food distribution, shared water, and guided injured neighbors to makeshift shelters. Buddhist temples offered both spiritual comfort and physical aid. In these first weeks, the boundary between rescuer and victim blurred, as those who could still act carried others, often at the expense of their own safety. Photographic documentation began to capture the unprecedented scale of destruction. Images show burnt corpses in streets, survivors with burns and swollen faces, and lines of people waiting for water or medical attention. Many photographs were taken by Japanese military photographers, capturing both the human suffering and the scale of infrastructural collapse. Later, foreign journalists and researchers would include these images in reports, creating a permanent visual record of the rescue struggle. As external aid slowly arrived from neighboring cities, the focus of rescue shifted from spontaneous survival to structured care. Hospitals that had survived the blast were reinforced with supplies, field units were dispatched to manage shelters, and medical teams began cataloging injuries. Despite these improvements, the mortality rate among victims remained high due to delayed effects of radiation exposure, compounded burns, and infection. The weeks following the bombing became a period of dual realities: immense loss and sustained human effort. While death continued to claim the weak, acts of rescue, compassion, and organization also shaped the unfolding narrative of Hiroshima, a city simultaneously destroyed and defined by human endurance. By early September 1945, Hiroshima had begun the slow process of stabilization. Fires had mostly burned out, though pockets of smoldering debris persisted. Temporary shelters and emergency medical posts had been established outside the city center. Survivors, though traumatized and physically weakened, worked to organize relief, clean streets, and recover the dead. Photographers and officials documented the unprecedented scene, creating records that would later serve as crucial historical evidence of both the devastation and the rescue efforts. The Japanese government faced the full realization of the atomic attack. Hiroshima was no longer merely a military setback, but a catastrophic symbol of the destructive power of nuclear warfare. Military leaders, already aware of Japan's precarious position, recognized that conventional defenses would be ineffective against such weapons. The sense of urgency accelerated the decision-making process that had already been underway following the Potsdam Declaration. Japan's surrender, announced on August 15, 1945, marked the formal end of World War II in the Pacific. The impact of Hiroshima was inseparable from this surrender. The bombing demonstrated the futility of continued resistance, highlighting the destructive capabilities available to the United States and signaling the dawning of the nuclear age. Yet while the world debated strategy, morality, and the consequences of atomic warfare, the human reality within Hiroshima remained immediate and raw. Medical and humanitarian challenges continued for months. Burn injuries required long-term care. Radiation sickness caused delayed mortality and chronic illness. Families struggled to recover what remained of their homes, possessions, and social networks. The psychological trauma endured by survivors would persist for generations, forming the basis for studies on post-traumatic stress long before the term entered common usage. International observers began examining the bombing's humanitarian implications. Reports circulated documenting the scale of death, injury, and suffering, revealing the limits of conventional emergency response when faced with nuclear destruction. The Hiroshima experience reshaped planning for civil defense, disaster medicine, and emergency logistics worldwide. Relief organizations studied the crisis to understand how to respond to mass casualties under extreme conditions. Photographs and films of rescue efforts, taken under extreme conditions, became central to historical understanding. They showed civilians, soldiers, and volunteers carrying the wounded, improvising medical care, and searching ruins for survivors. These images conveyed both the unprecedented horror of nuclear attack and the resilience of those who acted to save lives despite overwhelming obstacles. Hiroshima's aftermath also influenced future global military and diplomatic strategy. The scale of destruction prompted the international community to confront ethical questions about nuclear weapons, civilian targeting, and the responsibilities of both aggressors and rescuers. Rescue efforts, while limited in preventing immediate death, provided a narrative of human courage and compassion that would define the city's legacy. As relief operations gradually stabilized, and the world began to absorb the magnitude of nuclear warfare, the long-term consequences of Hiroshima's destruction became clear. The city would never be the same, and the rescue efforts within it would remain a testament to human endurance under unimaginable circumstances. Hiroshima stands today not only as a city rebuilt from ashes, but as a symbol of human endurance, resilience, and the fragile boundary between life and annihilation. The rescue efforts of August 6, 1945, reveal a truth that transcends strategy and politics. When conventional systems fail, humanity persists. Strangers became rescuers, civilians became medics, and ordinary acts of compassion shaped the survival of thousands amidst a landscape of total destruction. The atomic bombing introduced a new dimension to warfare, one in which death could arrive invisibly, instantaneously, and indiscriminately. Rescue workers contended not only with fire and debris, but with an unseen enemy, radiation. Yet even as medical understanding lagged, the instinct to save lives prevailed, forging a testament to courage in the face of the unimaginable. These rare images of rescue, the photographs and testimonies that survived, allow us to witness the fragility of civilization under extreme force. They remind us that the consequences of human innovation can be both creative and catastrophic. Beyond the statistics and history books, Hiroshima's survivors and rescuers reveal the human heart's capacity for endurance, empathy, and moral action, even when the world around them collapses. In reflecting on Hiroshima, we confront a dual legacy: the destructive power of human invention and the quiet, persistent power of human compassion. The city's rescue efforts, though often overwhelmed by scale, endure as a profound example of resilience, a lesson in both the cost of war and the potential for humanity to rise, even amid devastation.